So welcome to our webinar, one of the webinars in our series on iNaturalist, and some of the ins and outs of the site, and this one in particular about how citizen science provides some key data for endangered species conservation. I'd like to start by acknowledging with immense gratitude that the land from which I'm presenting and where I live, work, and play is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. The Algonquin peoples have lived on this land since time immemorial, and I am very grateful to have this opportunity to be present in this territory. So we're joined today by Dr. John Reynolds, the chair of COSEWIC, to discuss how citizen science contributes to the conservation of endangered species. This webinar will be recorded and will be available on CWF's website. The easiest way to find that is going to be to Google CWF webinar, and you'll be able to find it from there. I'm just going to double check. Is everyone seeing my main screen of the presentation, or are you seeing the notes on my slide? Okay, great. It just looked like it was showing differently on my screen here for a second. Okay, great. So I myself, I'm the Species at Risk and Biodiversity Specialist at the Canadian Wildlife Federation. I've also been the lead and involved in the creation and bringing iNaturalist to Canada, iNaturalist Canada, with the working with the folks at iNaturalist.org. Dr. John Reynolds is the chair of the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada. He's also the professor of aquatic ecology and conservation at Simon Fraser University. And for any of those of you on iNaturalist, you probably will have seen his name show up quite a few times, as he is the top observer of most observations in Canada. So definitely a great resource and person to have speaking to us. So I'm happy to have John helping out and presenting on this webinar. A couple of logistics for Zoom. If you're having any problems, check your audio settings, maybe log off and log back on with the same credentials that you, or the link that you had originally, if the things aren't coming through quite correctly. We have disabled, or have the chat is only to, you'll be able to chat with just John and I if you're having any technical issues, and I'll try and help walk you through that. We'll use the Q&A for any questions that you might have in that sense. So I encourage you to write your questions as we go. We will answer most of them at the end, but if there's a couple like simple or technical questions, I can write them in when I'm not presenting, and I can kind of answer directly in real time. But other ones we'll write them in as we go, but we'll pose them to John and I at the end. If for any reason this webinar does end abruptly, which has only happened once, but if it does, please just rejoin using that same link that you had originally. So just a touch about Canadian Wildlife Federation. We're one of Canada's largest conservation organizations, and we undertake projects and conservation work across the country. Our mission is to conserve and inspire the conservation of Canadians' wildlife and habitats. And we do this in a few ways. And one is through engaging the public and youth in citizen science like iNaturalist Canada and what we're going to hear about today, as well as education programs like Wild Outside and the Canadian Conservation Corps. We also carry out specific conservation projects in the freshwater, marine, and terrestrial environments. We are the lead in iNaturalist Canada. We partner with Parks Canada, the Royal Ontario Museum, and NatureServe Canada to help run it. And iNaturalist Canada is part of one of many, as part of a global network across the world of various iterations of iNaturalists. So right now we have 18 countries around the world, including Canada. We launched iNaturalist.ca in 2015. And there are a few more countries that are already in the works. So it is a global network. Each country has their own iteration and version of iNaturalist, but they all feed into this global database known as iNaturalist.org that is run out of the California Academy of Sciences in partnership with National Geographic. iNaturalist in Canada, we have over 6 million observations. Actually, I just checked this morning and we're 6.5 million observations. That's second only to the US, where iNaturalist originated from and has been in operation for a long time. So we have a pretty good track record going across the various iterations across the world. The benefit to affiliating or to look to being part of the local country network is that data can be more easily shared for conservation in Canada, affiliating with iNaturalist.ca. It's a bilingual platform, French and English, and we also have Canada-specific and bilingual resources that are specific to what we've created for iNaturalist.ca that .org may not have. So I would encourage you, if you don't know or aren't already affiliated with iNaturalist.ca, check your account settings and you can choose to affiliate with a specific gateway or network, which would be iNaturalist Canada. And so essentially it is a database of current and past species occurrences. And this is the Canadian kind of snapshot of the database that does, as I said, feed into the global one. So all of these observations are mapped and verifiable by a photo or sound recording. People who contribute can be anyone, ranging from beginners to experts. So basically anybody who can take a digital photo with a smartphone or digital camera, or can record a sound recording, can contribute to iNaturalist. And I'll talk to you on this theme by looking at what this database is, and with a slant, I'm looking at species at risk and threatened species in Canada. So anywhere on iNaturalist.ca, you can find the Explore tab, which is here along the top. Anywhere you go, that bar will show up. And it essentially brings up this map, and you can filter this by a number of ways. So when you click on the Filters tab, you can see here there's a few filter options. You can search by species, by date, and in this case, we're going to look at threatened species. When you click on threatened species, it's defaulted to show all species in Canada. Click Update Search, and we now have a database that's filtered by and showing only the species that are flagged as threatened in Canada. Now, I say threatened, but not all of these species are actually threatened in Canada. As I mentioned, iNaturalist is a global database, so these categories are also based on the IUCN list of vulnerable, endangered, and critically endangered species. So even if something is critically endangered elsewhere, it may not be so in Canada. The other layer as well is that these are also based on the NatureServe ranks, and I'll explain what that is. So they're basically these three categories that you can see: the IUCN red list and NatureServe category. So in that red box are what are flagged as threatened species in iNaturalist. And you can see the definitions. I'm not going to go through all that, but they can always be looked up online as well to see what actually lands into these categories. But as I mentioned, not all of these species are threatened in Canada. We have a few of these species that are actually quite common here in Canada. And so as I mentioned, these are flagged globally. So these are all species that are flagged as threatened species in iNaturalist, but they're actually not. And eastern hemlock is a good one that's quite common in Canada. And there's actually some that are not endemic to Canada that are flagged as such in the database. So all that just to bear in mind when we're looking and using these filters for threatened species. And I'll explain how you can see what that is for each species in a minute. Coming back to the database, as we zoom in on the observation page, you'll start to see different color markers. So each one of these little points is an observation that somebody has made using either the iNaturalist app or online at iNaturalist.ca. These colors are broken up by species groups, so mammals or insects. And so you notice if you look closely, some of these are solid points. Actually, most of them would be solid points on the map. The color is solid and there's a little pin at the bottom, but some of them are like this, which are kind of semi-transparent circles. These transparent circles are species that are flagged as obscured or obscured in iNaturalist. So these are species that are obscured in iNaturalist, and they are the true location is hidden because for a number of reasons, but one is that they could be they are potentially subject to persecution or harm. So if the true location is known, it might put these species at an elevated risk for either poaching or collection or sometimes even being loved to death. If people flock to an area to observe a species, it can actually harm either the species or the habitat. So there's a list of species that are automatically hidden in this way. And these points are not actually where the observation was taken, but it's a random point within about a 20 by 20 square kilometer or 20 kilometer by 20 kilometer box, and it's a random point within that. So when you're seeing these markers, just bear that in mind when you're looking at data and seeing and looking at where a species actually occurs. And we're actually in the midst right now of updating which species are automatically obscured. Right now, there's quite a few, and we're trying to narrow that down to only the species that are truly at risk of poaching or collection if their observation is actually known. When you click on any one of these markers, you can see the observation itself. And if you click on the observation somewhere on the name or in the photo, it brings you to the observation page, which gives you more information on the occurrence, the identifications, and any comments that people have made. I'll note, if you look at the top there, there's a little VU, and you can click on that, which will explain why this species was flagged as threatened. And in this case, it is because of, it is a Canadian specific reason, and it is listed as an N3, so imperiled in Canada. Now you might see, if you click on this and it's an IUCN rationale, then it'll say IUCN reasoning, and it's, you know, as the threat category for that species. And so why is this all valuable? Well, for one, people don't need to be experts to contribute. So simply taking a photo can have real conservation impacts. You know, it helps protect the habitat of endangered species. When the species is known to be there, there's sometimes legal protection, and that can be afforded. It increases the knowledge of distribution and understanding populations across Canada, and it engages people in conservation and helps raise awareness in that sense. So to help learn more about the environment and what's around them. So as I mentioned, like basically being able to take a photo is all we need to be able to contribute and help in conservation of endangered species, but also some of the more common ones. And with that, I'll turn it over to John, who will provide some more detail on kind of how important this can be in the context of species at risk through iNaturalist and other citizen science avenues.
All right, well, thank you very much, James. And yeah, it's a pleasure to be invited to give this talk. And I'm coming to you from the unceded territory of the Coast Salish people of the west coast of Canada. I live in Greater Vancouver, and my background here is real. And I'm very privileged to live and work in this unceded territory. So I will share my screen with you. Okay, is that coming through full screen, James?
Yeah, perfectly.
Okay, great. So yes, this talk combines some of my favorite things. Citizen science, which is a hobby of mine. Also, I have had a lifelong interest in my career in working on conservation, so endangered species. And as James mentioned, I'm the chair of the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada. And so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to, first of all, tell you how that committee, COSEWIC, operates and how it fits into our federal species at risk program. I will then use examples from COSEWIC, from our status assessments of threatened species, and to show you how, in fact, we can incorporate citizen science, including iNaturalist, that James has just been talking about, and how we can put that into our status reports and help us to understand the status of species. And at the end, I'll just conclude with some thoughts on where next, where else are we going with the use of citizen science or community science in helping to understand where endangered species are and hopefully to do something to help them out. So let's begin with the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada and how it fits in with our federal species at risk program. There are three key steps in the federal program to protect at-risk species. And it begins with COSEWIC, which is the group I'm about to introduce you to, when a status report is generated by our committee. So we start things off and decide what the status is of a species. And if that species is deemed to have some level of risk attached to it, then the Minister of the Environment can decide whether or not to protect it under the Federal Species at Risk Act. The minister doesn't have to use that act, even if the species is in trouble. They can use other legislation or other methods to try to recover it. The Species at Risk Act is in some ways the legislation of last resort when everything else, all of our other policies at various levels have failed. And if the decision is, in fact, to list the species for protection under SARA, then that kicks off the federal recovery program, which involves writing reports and doing what people can to help the species to survive and to recover. So we're at the front end of this three-step process and as mandated by federal legislation. COSEWIC has been around for a long time. It was established in 1977, and it's an independent body of scientists who assess the status of Canadian species, and we are volunteers. And when this had been going on for quite some time, long before we had federal legislation, in fact, but when SARA was proclaimed in 2003, they made the COSEWIC position official as the group that was responsible for assessing the status of species. The group had already been doing it collectively for a very long time, and so that was the decision that was made when the legislation came into force. And here you can see in the photograph, here we are after during a species assessment meeting where we've all gotten together, which we do twice a year to assess the status of species. So our role is to assess status and identify threats. That's written into the legislation, and to inform our status decisions to the Minister of the Environment. So we answer, well, we don't answer to the Minister of the Environment in the sense that we are appointed by the minister, and we communicate our results then to the public. It's more interesting to think about what we do not do. And we do not have anything to do with decisions about listing under SARA, and we have nothing to do with recovery. Okay, so once we have submitted our reports to the minister of what the status of species is, we are finished. We're moving on to the next assessments. We have nothing to do with protection or recovery or advocacy. That is the job of the government, not us. And it's really important to emphasize that we are in fact independent. Although we're appointed by the minister, the minister makes these appointments based on the recommendations of COSEWIC itself. So we run our own selection process for applicants to join our committee. And the members are not there to represent any organization. So we're not there on behalf of any particular organization. We're there because we are experts on the status on endangered species. And so we leave our hats at the door, and our evaluations are only based on evidence, and that's both science and Aboriginal traditional knowledge. And we completely ignore any of the consequences of our decisions. So we don't think about the costs that might be imposed or the benefits that might come from whatever may happen with the species at risk process downstream of our decision. So you'll never hear somebody at a COSEWIC meeting say, well, if we say that that particular salmon population is endangered, that could cause, shutdown of lots of fisheries, and that would be really bad. Well, that's irrelevant to our considerations. We simply look at the evidence of status. And similarly, you would never hear someone say, yes, if that freshwater mussel in southwestern Ontario is deemed to be at risk, then all kinds of good things could happen in that habitat to restore it and other endangered species along the way. Again, you'll never hear that. We don't think about it. That is not relevant to assessing status. So we play it straight. We're independent, and I think a lot of our credibility comes from the fact that people realize that. It's up to the government to make the difficult decisions after we have decided what the status is. It's a big committee. We have, technically, we have 62 appointed members. Many of those members share a vote between two people. And so there's 34 votes, and these are the votes that happen at our meetings when we decide what the status of a species is. And so there are 8 people appointed from federal departments. Again, they're not there to represent the government. They're there because they know a lot about endangered wildlife, plants and animals. We have 26 people who are appointed to our committee by provinces and territories. So, and again, they share a vote together on each species. 4 non-government science members. We have 2 early career members. This was a really successful innovation that we brought in a couple of years ago. Lots of interest in it. And here we're really interested in helping to mentor earlier career science members, and they're bringing a lot to us in return. We have 20 co-chairs of species specialist subcommittees. I'll unpack that in a moment. And also 2 co-chairs from Aboriginal Traditional Knowledge Subcommittee. So there's a lot of people contributing their time as volunteers to this committee. The heart of our operations is really at the level of subcommittees, which are additional people that are brought in to help to assess particular groups that they have expertise in. And here you can see them. We've covered quite a bit of ground. There's a few things missing here, but these are the species groups so far that we've had enough data and interest to be assessing. And so each of these subcommittees has 2 co-chairs, and they're appointed to the big meetings. They're appointed to COSEWIC, but then there's about 12 more people, 10 to 12 more people added in who are really doing the hard work of commissioning status reports from externally, working with the report writers, editing them, putting them through peer review, and suggesting what the status is. So if you add in all those people to the 62 that I just mentioned, it adds up to about 190 experts across the country who are contributing their time as volunteers to help us to understand the status of at-risk species. One of the most important subcommittees, and certainly one of the busiest ones, is our Aboriginal Traditional Knowledge Subcommittee. This was quite an innovative subcommittee when it was first created, and the members are, most of the members are nominated by national Aboriginal organizations, and their task is to incorporate Aboriginal traditional knowledge into our assessment reports. So members of this subcommittee are also members of various species specialist subcommittees. So they're right at the table when decisions are being made about status and the editing of reports. And they work to ensure that the best available Aboriginal traditional knowledge is incorporated into our status reports and to make sure it's done properly. We usually cannot afford to go and obtain new Aboriginal traditional knowledge, so this subcommittee is tasked with doing the research to find out what available information there is. And in some cases, if there's a lot of it and it's a high profile species, they will write their own report, which summarizes that information. And then again, they help to make sure that it goes in properly to our status assessments. We've assessed some species where frankly, we probably couldn't have done it if it hadn't been for traditional knowledge, which can be, in many cases, can really help to clarify the status of species for which otherwise we don't have a lot of information. So the process then is that we have a system for deciding which species we should look at. We can't look at everything. We can look at about 80 wildlife species per year, and that's pushing it. We are supported by a 13-person secretariat in Ottawa, and who are very, very important in helping to keep us going and to do all the hard work behind the scenes, and including production of the status reports and so on. And so we prioritize species to look at. We'd love to look at more, but with the resources we have, this is what we can do. We then commission a status report with a call for bids for people to write the status reports. And then we send them out for 3 rounds of peer review and assess the status at 2 meetings per year. And observers are indeed welcome to come to these meetings and see how we operate. We often get quite a lot of observers sitting in, listening, seeing how we figure out the status of species. I should mention when I talk about sending reports out for review, by the time one of our status reports goes to the Minister of the Environment, on average, it has been looked at 100 times. It's had 100 reviews have been done on these status reports. So I'm not saying we never make mistakes. We do, but it's certainly not for lack of effort at getting oversight from experts who look at these reports and try to make sure that we've got the right information. The final thing I'll say about our methods is that we use these quantitative criteria by the IUCN, the global body that produces the red list of threatened species around the world. These are tried and true criteria. They've been around for quite a while. They're constantly being refined, and we have 5 different ways in which we can determine if a species has some sort of at-risk status. So, for example, population decline, there are criteria for how rapidly a population must have declined over the past 3 generations or 10 years, whichever is longer. And if it's declined a lot, then it could be endangered. If it's declined at a certain different threshold, percent change, it'll be threatened, or it could be just special concern, meaning it's not quite threatened, but it could become so quite easily in the future. So various ways, the species has to only trigger any one of these to get to be determined to be at risk. And you can see that we have various combinations of small population sizes, and declines can also be invoked. You know, we don't have time series or population decline for most species that we assess. And so we do for birds usually, and often marine fish and some marine mammals, but otherwise it's usually one of the other criteria that we will use to understand what the symptoms are of species that may be in trouble. So here's what a meeting looks like. This was in Ottawa in 2019. That was our last meeting that we had in person. And so sitting around the table are the members of COSEWIC in the background. We have members of the Secretariat who provide the vital support for our work. There are observers on the left side. And what you would have here is on the screen, which you can't read, it would be a motion for what the subcommittee, the relevant subcommittee thinks is the status of the species and the criteria. So for example, if this is Blanding's turtle, a species that Canadian Wildlife Federation is very interested in, then it would have been brought to the table by the 2 co-chairs here of the Amphibians and Reptiles subcommittee, and the person who's responsible for that report would be presenting it and then fielding questions. And you know, these discussions can go on for quite a while, and I always think of it as being comparable to a PhD defense, except you didn't write the thesis. There's a report writer who wrote the thesis, but by the time it comes to the big table, the co-chair really owns it, and they will take questions on all manner of things. And then eventually, when I sense that the discussion is starting to die down, I will call a vote, and there's an anonymous vote using clickers, and it has to pass by 2/3 majority. If it doesn't, I'll call for another motion and we try again. And sometimes we go back and forth a little bit. It can often be very difficult to predict which species are going to be tripping us up and which ones are going to be straightforward, but eventually we figure it out. If we can't figure it out right away, I'll call a coffee break or tell people to figure it out over lunch, and we come back and take a fresh crack at it. So at that meeting, we discussed just a sample of species. It's fascinating, the species that we talk about. Big variety, you can see from ring seal to chestnut-colored longspur. There's a shagreen snail there in the middle. It's found on 2 limestone islands in Lake Erie near Point Pelee, and so on. So a large number of species, and it's fascinating to read these status reports and to hear about species. So I want to now transition into talking about information sources. In particular, I want to move now toward citizen science or community science. I'm using the terms interchangeably. I've already told you about our use of Aboriginal traditional knowledge and so-called science or Western science. But how do we use information that lay people have contributed to understanding the status or distributions or abundances of species? That's what I'm going to focus on for most of the rest of this talk. Well, first of all, I should tell you we have an awful lot of citizen science programs that we can choose from. So just for birds, for example, people are often bird crazy. And so with all those hobbyists out there, there are lots of ways to gather information on birds from the public. And so we have Christmas bird counts. Those have been going on for 120 years now, and where people throughout North America and increasingly in Central and South America will go out and into a defined region and count all the birds that they see. And this is a tremendous wealth of information for the status of species that can be found roughly around the Christmas period. It's not literally on Christmas Day, but it's within a week either side of it. Then there's eBird. eBird is one of the largest citizen science platforms in the world. And I'm going to take a risk and see if I can, I'm just going to end the show. I'm going to go on to the eBird website for a second. I want to show you something here. So not there. Let's go to eBird. This is eBird here. Can you see that? Is this full screen, James?
Yeah, I'm seeing your tabs at the top, but we're seeing eBird for sure.
All right, that's the best I can do. So this is the eBird, and those yellow dots, those little explosions that are happening, every time one of those goes off, somebody has just submitted a checklist of the birds they've seen in a given walk to eBird. So you can see there's some just went off in Central America, Florida. There's one up, looks like it might be Alberta. And so each one of those dots is a new checklist that someone somewhere in the world has just submitted to eBird. All the white pale dots are ones that have already been submitted in the last 24 hours, roughly. And if you look at the counter in the top screen, you can see that today, however that is defined, depending on your time zone, we have 12,000 checklists have been submitted to eBird. That's just today. Where I am, it's 9:36 in the morning. And you can see that number is continuing to go up as people submit checklists. And these checklists include not only how many individuals of the different species people have been seeing, but also in most cases, they include how far people walked and how long they spent doing it, so that you can analyze the data per unit effort, which is a key thing that we really like to see in citizen science projects. So eBird is enormous, and it is certainly been very helpful. There's so many papers that have been published in conservation that use data from eBird. So that's eBird. I'm going to go back to full screen. All good, James, with that now?
Yeah, we got you perfect.
Okay, great. I got away with it. So, so that's eBird, and certainly that information is allowing us to understand and visualize birds in a way that is really quite revolutionary. Another source is breeding bird surveys. So, breeding. Well, I'll tell you about those in a second. But essentially, these are again by volunteers, and these are cases where people will do a certain survey route every year, the same route, and they count all the birds that they see along that route. A hugely valuable resource. It's coordinated jointly between both Canada and the US. And then we have breeding bird atlases, which are an awful lot of fun. I love breeding bird atlases, where it's usually a 5-year project to record the status of whether or not birds are breeding throughout a given province or group of provinces. So I'm going to give you some examples now from each of those two platforms, breeding bird surveys and breeding bird atlases. And the example I'm going to start with is a barn swallow. COSEWIC assessed this species as being threatened with extinction in 2011. This is something that none of us who were around in the 80s would have ever seen coming. But aerial insectivorous birds in general have been declining, partly due to problems with declining numbers of prey, of insect prey, and also some habitat issues. So barn swallow, which was just the bird that we all took for granted for so long, suddenly was declared to be threatened by COSEWIC in 2011. Real wake-up call for a lot of us, actually. And let me give you an example of kind of evidence that we used in our status report to get there. Here is the breeding bird atlas for the Maritimes. So the darker the color, the greater the probability that barn swallows breed somewhere within that geographical square. This is all contributed, these data are contributed by volunteers who go out and record the bird, all of the birds they see, but in this case, it's just for the barn swallow that I'm showing you. And the scary thing is the squares that have a black dot in the middle, but they're white. These are places where they were found during the first atlas 20 years earlier, but not during the more recent atlas. So look at how barn swallows have disappeared from large chunks of New Brunswick, for example, and other areas. So, and this is in spite of the fact that there would have been a lot more people looking for them in the second atlas than the first. So this provides some pretty important evidence that something is amiss with these birds, and it's thanks to citizen science. Another source of information are breeding bird surveys I told you, and they tell a similar story. And here's the decline of barn swallows through time from citizen science, and you can see they really got into quite a bit of trouble. Something started really going wrong for them in the 80s. Now the rate of decline has slowed in the last part of that time series, but nonetheless, that was enough to trigger a threatened status. I'm pleased to say that we've updated this status report this spring, and because every 10 years we try to reassess species after the information goes out of date. And when we reassessed it, here's what the new data look like. And you can see that indeed the rate of decline has slowed almost to a standstill. So they're still declining just a tiny bit lately, but much less than they were during the earlier period. And so the result of that was that COSEWIC downgraded their status from threatened to being merely of special concern. Meaning they're not threatened with extinction. They could become so if something bad happens in the near future. Other thing I just want to tell you is how sophisticated these analytics are that allow you to have such a tight area of uncertainty around the data here. So this is really just an amazing data set to have. The green aren't too important, but those are the number of routes that volunteers were walking along and driving, which gave us this information. So I don't know how we could have done this, quite frankly, without citizen science. All the information I've just given you is basically citizen science. There just aren't enough scientific surveys independent of mad, keen birders out there for us to do this kind of work. Here's a very different example. This is called the American bumblebee. Now, I always think that if something's has such a bland name, it couldn't possibly be in trouble. Unfortunately, that is not the case. And COSEWIC designated it to be a special concern in 2018. How did we figure that out? Well, it was hard because it's so uncommon that we don't have a meaningful time series over the last 10 years, which is what you would need for this species. So the committee got somewhat creative and looked at the percentage of bumblebee specimens in museums over time, decade by decade, and asked what percentage of them are that species. So you can see they went from being about 5% of museums specimens back in between 47 and 1956 to less than 1%. Now that seems to have stabilized over these 3 decadal periods though. So, we don't really know what to do with that, but the bottom line was that it looks as if the decline may have stabilized. And so special concern is where we ended up. Now, this has been challenged by some people who mistakenly thought that the criteria could apply right to the start of the time series instead of over the last 10 years. But nonetheless, some experts really who know a lot about this species do think that they're in more trouble than we did. And well, how do we know? Well, here's one bit of information. This is Bumblebee Watch. People can submit photographs of bumblebees to this site. And here you can see this is its Canadian distribution. It's Southern Ontario species. And there are 46 observations, photographs that have been verified by experts. You can't always tell from a photograph, but we have 46 observations. You can see that it goes from, I just want to point out a little bit on the edge of its range. I guess it seems to go up toward the base of the Canadian Shield. You can see it's in Prince Edward County, but not Kingston. Okay, I want this for reference when I'm showing you another map. You can see it's not quite at the base of the Bruce Peninsula, and it goes over to Norfolk County here. Sorry, there's Norfolk County. It's over further west. This would be Essex County. So that's its distribution. Not many, and that's all that had been submitted to Bumblebee Watch. But you can also go to iNaturalist, and iNaturalist has 174 records that are so-called verified or research-grade observations, where at least two people agree on the ID. And now you can see that we've expanded the known range, at least the contemporary range. There's one all the way up in Huntsville, which is kind of a surprise. It goes up to Kingston. It's at the base of the Bruce Peninsula, and all the way down to Pelee and Windsor. So what's the status of this species? Well, right now, I don't know. But what's happened is that because there's so much interest in this species, people are looking for them, and they're putting a lot more observations into iNaturalist and Bumblebee Watch than they used to. And so the one thing I do know is that when we reassess the status of this species 10 years after our original assessment, this kind of citizen science information is going to be key to figuring it out. This is probably going to be what will drive the assessment. I hope we don't have to use museum specimen percentages again, because that has all kinds of biases in it. And so there's lots of questions about how to do it. It gives us a rough idea, but that's about it. Now I want to talk about something, not only because it has an amazing name, the painted hand mudbug. I mean, doesn't get much better than that for a name of a species. But I want to talk about it because this was a species that was discovered as a new species for Canada. It's thought to be native as a result of iNaturalist. So Colin Jones, who is an arthropod, he himself is a biologist and an arthropod specialist, but he's not a specialist on crayfish. He found this thing and in the Ojibwe Prairie in Windsor, and put it up on iNaturalist as a certain species, the most common one you'd expect it to be. But an expert saw it, expert from the state said, no, that's a such and such. That's a painted hand mudbug. And sure enough, it was new to Canada. And so they got together, they did a few more surveys. They wrote a paper on this. You can see it's called The First Record of This Species. And the significance of iNaturalist in making new discoveries. So they got together and published this paper. So we've discovered a new species in Canada by fluke through iNaturalist. I want to talk about one that I'm kind of keen on. This is a Grappletale. It's a beautiful dragonfly. It's only known from 6 or 7 locations in southwestern British Columbia. And COSEWIC assessed its status this spring. And in the run-up to that, because we knew it was coming, I organized a little field expedition to see if we could go and find some, to see if they were at the original sites where they had first been reported, and if we could find any more. And I was guided in part by iNaturalist, because if you go on iNaturalist, you find this beautiful photograph by Jeremy Gatton of a Grappletale. It was in a site where they were known in a provincial park. And it's a stream insect, by the way. They're found in the outflows of warm lakes, right at the northern edge of its range. And so we got a few of us got together. Jeremy Gatton came over, and also Jennifer Heron, who is an arthropods endangered species specialist, works for the BC government, and she's also one of the co-chairs of the COSEWIC arthropod subcommittee, and also Brian Starzomski, who's a member of that subcommittee and someone I work very closely with on all things to do with iNaturalist and citizen science. And so here we are, this creek, this is the beginning of the creek on the left here. We walked up to the creek and there it was. We found one immediately. This is the first time they'd been seen there since they were first reported there 40 years ago. And in fact, we found 16 of them along about an 800-meter stretch of that creek. We also went to a new site that someone suggested, and we walked into this creek and it was totally unsuitable because it's all jammed with logs and not fast enough flowing. It had all the wrong characteristics until one flew past us. And so here, Jeremy over here, and this is me, we're photographing one up in a tree here. Brian Starzomski took this photograph. And so we found it at a new site, and overall it's known from 7 locations in British Columbia. Some of them are well protected in provincial parks. And this all led the committee to decide that it's special concern, not threatened with extinction, but certainly something to keep an eye on. And I think that was a good call by the committee. And now if you go to iNaturalist and you look up Grappletale, it looks like there's thousands of them because we've put every single one we've ever photographed onto iNaturalist. And in fact, several experts have gone to some of these sites that they found through iNaturalist and taken their own photographs and added them as well. So we've just learned a heck of a lot about this insect, and in part through iNaturalist and the observations that are there. Okay, so I'm bouncing all over the taxonomic map here. Let's talk about a millipede. This is Carmanah Walbren Provincial Park, an old growth forest on the west coast of Vancouver Island. I teach a field course every year in nearby Bamfield, and I took the students to spend 2 nights in this provincial park camping, and naturally there was a project that I assigned them that involved using iNaturalist. They got points for finding rare species, that sort of thing. And so if you take a bunch of keeners and you tell them, okay, this is your assignment, go find stuff, they will find stuff. Here they are, iNatting at night in the rain, looking for things that they can upload to iNaturalist. And one of the things we found quite often was this millipede. Now, I thought this was a common yellow-spotted millipede. They're all over the place. And I posted them to iNaturalist, but an expert said, no, no, no. You have found an Olympic millipede, and it's the first one that has ever been put into iNaturalist. And so there are our dots. There's myself and a couple of our students who put them in there. And those were the first that we had in Carmanah. Now, the interesting thing is that the arthropod subcommittee of COSEWIC already had their eye on this species. It was on a watch list of potential species that they might be assessing for their status in the future, because they knew it was in the area. It was known to occur in this general region, but we didn't know much else about it. And so if you go to their candidate list, it was down as a possible species that might be worth looking at. But when the arthropod subcommittee saw that my class had uploaded all these photographs of them, and I told them that we could have done a lot more, and it's in a protected area, they decided it was not a high priority. And so in this case, citizen science was responsible for us not wasting our time looking at a species that is probably not at risk of extinction. Certainly, it's not as important a priority as many of the other species that we wanted to look at. And just by way of postscript, I was in Bamfield this summer, and as I was getting into my car, I looked at in a gravel parking lot, and I found a dead millipede. And there it is, and that's an Olympic peninsula millipede. So indeed, I don't think these things are in any real trouble at all. The last example I want to give you is close to my home. If you look behind me, if you go up from here, maybe as the crow flies, maybe 300 meters, there's a swamp, and there's a road beside the swamp. It's through a regional park, and rough-skinned newts migrate to and from that swamp every year, and they get killed by traffic. It's kind of a gruesome set of photos here. So people set up a project in iNaturalist where you could report your rough-skinned newt observations from that regional park. This is by a biologist who works for the parks. And the idea was to figure out where are they crossing the road and when are they getting hit. And here's a map of the observations that has been generated. And so the swamp is just encircled by that path. That swamp is maybe, I don't know, 700 meters long, maybe. And here's the road. And these are newts that have been seen crossing the road. Some of them are dead, some of them are alive. There are local people who have been trying to save them. And you can see they're crossing over a very long stretch of road, unfortunately. I was hoping there'd be a single bottleneck, but this information is now being used to advocate for putting a couple of underpasses under the road to help the newts to avoid them getting killed by traffic. So with this information now, I'm not an expert on how you design these underpasses, but experts can now look at this and they can then make strategic decisions about how many are needed and also where to put them. So where are we going from here? Well, I've been very keen on undertaking a review within COSEWIC of how we can actually use this information even more effectively in our status reports. We can use projects to capture threatened species. So James mentioned that there is a tab that you can filter to look in a region at the threatened species. Well, we went one step further, and by we, I mean Brian Starzomski and I, and also Kate McEwen, who is the program manager of a project that Brian Starzomski and I are co-leading on using iNaturalist to assess the species in British Columbia provincial parks. And so this project automatically captures all the species that are listed as truly being in some level of risk within Canada. And you can see this has automatically gathered 41,000 observations. People don't have to know the status, they just have to upload the photo and the project grabs them automatically. And then the other thing is bias. The analytics have, in my opinion, trailed a little bit behind the rush to get observations. And so here's some work by Ellen Gertz, who is a master's student being co-supervised by Brian Starzomski and I. She's based in his lab at the University of Victoria. And it turns out if you look at the distance from the road, the vast majority of observations are taken within a very short distance of a road, within about 500 meters of a road. And so we've been using this and some other, we're pushing these analyses further to understand where people are actually going when they contribute to iNaturalist. So I'll leave it there. I want to thank, again, I want to thank the CWF for inviting me to give this talk and acknowledge a lot of funding partners and in particular BC Parks, who have funded this 3-year program that Brian Starzomski and I have been working on, gathering observations in provincial parks. We've repaid them by being on target to have obtained 500,000 observations of species in BC provincial parks. We're probably going to get there toward the end of the year. But again, thanks very much. And if we have some time for questions, James, I'll certainly be happy to take them. And I'll end my talk there.
Excellent. Thank you so much, John. That's great. I learned a lot of interesting stuff as well, and very, very great to see the congruencies between platforms and how each one has offered a lot of benefit to citizen science. Mm-hmm. Actually, maybe that we can start with that question then, and this might be something that both of us can think about. Is this question of what is the best platform to be using when posting observations of citizen science for the public to be using?
Yes, it depends partly on what it is, and I don't use just one. So I'm a keen birder and I like photography, and so I post my photos. I use eBird all the time. And when I have a photo of a bird, it goes on to both iNaturalist and I put it into my checklist in eBird. So I use the two all the time. iNaturalist is good because it can accept observations of any species at all, any plant, animal, fungus. Others are more specialized. I will say that one of the good things about this is that most of these citizen science platforms have all their information gathered together by the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, which is GBIF for short. So scientists can still get the information in most cases, regardless of which platform it goes into.
Yeah, that's great. That's kind of what I was going to say as well. I think, as you mentioned, iNaturalist is it can't do everything because it's trying to collect everything, right? So when it's not focused on any one species, anything can be added, from a bird to a plant to a protozoa to fungi. So yeah, it doesn't do the same things eBird does do, which it can't because it's not that focused. So I think that's a kind of a blend of them makes a lot of sense. I think, as you mentioned, the idea of the search effort, which is something that eBird can capture, iNaturalist, again, because it doesn't easily standardize across taxa. Search effort for a bird versus a turtle versus an arthropod may be a little bit different on how you measure that. Similarly, I like the example of the Bumblebee Watch or compared with iNaturalist data as well. I think some of these additional other platforms also have projects within iNaturalist. So something like Bumblebee Watch can actually create a project in iNaturalist and get the data from iNaturalist into their own platform as well. And then they have the expertise to help specifically with bumblebees. And an extra note on the painted head mudbug example of a new species that was found. Also, just last year, another new species was found as a result of iNaturalist, which was an invasive species called the zigzag sawfly. And it was an iNaturalist observer who didn't know what it was, took a photo of a chew pattern in a leaf, and it was then identified by an entomologist who sent the photo to someone in the US, who then sent it to somebody in Germany, I think, and confirmed that's what the species was. And then since then, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency has gone to the site, confirmed, and now they're tracking that to avoid spread of the first occurrence in North America, let alone Canada. It was found in Quebec.
Right. Yes, we discovered a new species of springtail insect, new to science, this summer in the Okanagan, and I just wondered, that brings me to so Kelly has asked if there are projects, COSEWIC projects in the Okanagan, and indeed there are. And I should clarify, a project in iNaturalist is usually it's a location, doesn't have to be, but it's simply something that automatically gathers observations together under one roof. And as part of the BC Parks program, we have created projects for every single one of the 1,034 provincial parks and protected areas in BC. And so the South Okanagan protected area in particular is the first place I'd go if you want to see an Okanagan project. We've been sending our field team there all 3 of the past summers, and we never run out of new species to find in the Okanagan.
Maybe that's a good question then to lead into next about, there have been a few that are asking about access to the data from iNaturalist for projects in particular, but also people that maybe don't have projects in iNaturalist. So maybe I can touch on that people who create these projects in iNaturalist can be conservation organizations. And when an iNaturalist user joins a project, you can choose to provide the true locations of your observations to the people who run the project. So as I was talking about the obscured species earlier, that's a randomized point, but the true location you can see on your own account, and you can allow that access of that observation to project curators. So when they go and download the data, they can actually have the true location. Obviously, you want to make sure that those people are credible and trustable with that information.
Okay, I'd like to address a good question that Carrie Bergman has sent in, where a friend said that they're leery of the whole eBird thing because all these records are being housed in one arena under the control of a single university, Cornell, and building an empire and research, volunteers send in the data and then researchers pay for the data, and what happens if it crashes. So several things are actually, there's several misconceptions there. First of all, the data are downloadable by anyone for free. Researchers do not pay for the data. And second, because of this, eBird's data go to GBIF, which is a totally different place. So it's in a different location, and anybody can get the data from GBIF, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. It is not merely held by Cornell. Okay, so the data are shared freely, and yeah, I do. I mean, server crashes. I mean, it's always something we think about, and I can't tell you how secure they are or how certain they are, but I feel pretty confident that if Cornell servers fall apart, those data are in at least one other place through GBIF.
Yeah, great, thank you. I'm realizing we're at 1 o'clock Eastern time, which is kind of when we're scheduled to end. There are a lot of really good questions that are coming through still. John, are you available to stick around for a few more minutes, or do you want to, I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but for anybody who needs to leave, this is also recorded. So anybody that needs to leave can still listen in on the ending of the webinar later on.
Right. Sure. Yeah, that'll be fine. And there's a good one for you, James. I think the one from Angelique about rare plants being automatically obscured in iNaturalist to protect them from collectors.
Yes. So as I was talking earlier, I don't see the actual question, but if rare plants, so there's a list of species that are automatically obscured in iNaturalist for that very reason, for collection of rare plants and certain turtles, certain birds that may be overly viewed to death. I know eBird does that as well. We're working on updating that list now to be truly the ones that are subject to persecution and harm, we're calling it. So those will be automatically obscured, and that change should take effect. We'll give everybody an announcement, which is coming up in the next week or so, to give people time to mull that over, and that change will start taking effect this fall. The rationale basically being, like I said, there's a lot of species in iNaturalist that are not actually subject to persecution and harm, even some species at risk. It's actually better to know the location that we can help conserve that area and conserve the species. So we're trying to get it balanced between open as possible, but as closed as necessary kind of thing. And we've gone through a few iterations of that, speaking with local provincial experts and the iNaturalist community to try and get this list as good as possible. And it can always be updated as needed.
Mm-hmm. And I think, so I feel that we observers do have a certain personal responsibility to always put the welfare of the species first. And so even if iNaturalist doesn't automatically obscure the location, you may not want to post it if you don't want that particular, if you think that one, that one location is somewhere you don't want people to be going. Or you can post it, but you can automatically hit a button that obscures its location. So, if I wouldn't post the locations of rockfish, for example, with any precision. That would be an example, or lingcod on this coast. So I think you can always go take that extra step, and when in doubt, just leave it out.
And I should mention something that is somewhat new with iNaturalist and obscuring is that it now also obscures the date and time is when that observation is posted, to avoid people being able to look at nearby observations and say, oh, well, you saw this common species right in the same area at like 5 minutes earlier, it must be right here. So that's a new update that's happened as well to help protect these sensitive species.
Mm-hmm. So Kelly asks about, I don't know if I've got the question quite right, but is COSEWIC, COSEWIC certainly is watching bumblebee species quite a lot. And there are some upcoming status reports on additional species that are going to be coming from the arthropod subcommittee of additional bumblebees. So, bumblebees get a lot of attention lately. There are an awful lot of arthropods that are not quite as showy that are also in trouble, but definitely they're very much on their radar. And we have a lot of major bumblebee experts are actually on that subcommittee.
One maybe, John, that I could pose to you as well that's come through a couple times is about the ATK subcommittee, being about the numbers and representation for one, and I think you can probably speak to this about, the one person isn't the only person representing the ATK on COSEWIC. And also someone curious about, what does ATK look like? What does that data or information from ATK look like when talking about a species assessment?
Right, those are great questions. I don't actually see those questions in the chat. Are they near the beginning? Or?
It was near the beginning, I think, while you were talking. So yeah,
okay.
Like I said, there's good 50 or so hard to find them all.
Oh, really? Okay, I'm still not seeing it, but so the composition of the committee, the way it works is that most of the people are appointed by the Minister of the Environment and from 5 national Aboriginal organizations. So Congress of Aboriginal Peoples, for example, Inuit, Taparit, Kinatami, and so on. And so that's how they are appointed. They can also bring on additional people. And so I've forgotten exactly how big the committee is these days, but typically it would have about 15 people who are doing the work. And then in addition to that, they can then, they will then have funding that they can use to commission reports on species that are of particularly high profile, for which there is a large amount of Aboriginal traditional knowledge. So many species, many of the obscure little things that we have, don't really have any appreciable ATK that we can access. So they produce two types of reports. One is a source report, which simply is like a bibliography of sources of information that the report writer should look up to incorporate the information. And the other is that they will actually write a full report on the status, on the traditional knowledge that bears on a given species. So that then they can hand that entire product over to the report writer and the co-chair of the subcommittee that's responsible for it, and then work with them to incorporate this information. Does that answer this question that I can't find?
Yeah, I think
Okay.
so.
Yeah.
I had another question that I could answer with maybe a screen share about the resources of iNaturalist, because I mentioned early on about the Canada-specific resources and what iNaturalist we have for iNaturalist.ca. And this does tie into the BC project you're talking about, John. So people should see my screen there, all right?
Yep.
So we have a resources section in iNaturalist, and if you scroll down to the bottom, you see an About button there. Click on that, it brings you to this. It's also found, there's a link to this in our help section. So we have a few resources here, including this iNaturalist photo guide, which is something that John and the BC Parks Foundation put together, which are help to take better photos and capture the really key identifying features. We also have, all of these are in English and French. We also have a BioBlitz guide on how to build and design and run your own BioBlitz, as well as some videos that we've updated to be bilingual and have that kind of Canadian slant on, like how to use the app and the website. So yeah, just thought I'd mention that. A couple other resources actually, because this does tie into another question about the invasive species tie, and I won't go into all the how invasive species are working on iNaturalist. So I did give a webinar along with Canadian Council on Invasive Species just last Friday. So those webinars are all recorded, as well as this one will be. So that can also be viewed if you're interested specifically on invasive species. If you Google CWF webinars, you can find that, or look through them on our CWF page to give you more information on that as well.
Great. Might be worth us addressing the concern by Heather Charles that mentions that there are a number of species at risk in their community, and lots of tourists and visitors increasing who go off public trail systems or trespass on private land to access certain species which have declined as a result. And so concerns about capacity to manage people. And, this is the kind of thing that that certainly a lot of people take very seriously. And we've been watching for this in our work with BC Parks. And we have, often asked for any signs of trouble that they thought they could, attribute to our activities, to a promotion of citizen science. And so far, that has not actually materialized for us. We haven't seen it get pinned, problems getting pinned on citizen science and iNaturalist. So, but definitely, with the pandemic, so many protected areas just got, had a doubling of their numbers of visitors. And I know lots of managers and so on of our local regional parks who are just basically in crisis mode for, managing people. So I certainly hope that people are not trespassing to go and get species so they can take a photograph of it and not upload it to iNaturalist. I have not heard of that very often. But it is something to be mindful of. And I'm certainly, as a conservation biologist, I'm always very tuned to that potential problem.
Yeah. I'm not sure.
Oh, I see. Heather has explained it's people harvesting. Yeah, right. I certainly sympathize with that problem of trying to keep and not just taking pics. Yeah, that's pretty bad. And yes.
Maybe we can do maybe one or two last questions. Something that I think would be interesting for everybody is something from Matt Wallace asking about the bias between observations being posted in more accessible areas versus, so how does that influence urban conservation in the future? So obviously, if we look at the map of observations in Canada, you can kind of, it looks like a heat map, and obviously the more populated areas have more observations. Does that factor into a bias either when you're looking at COSEWIC assessments or conservation generally in Canada? Yeah,
it's a good point, and that's certainly true. The observations are where people go. So what it does is these observations can do is they can give us information, for example, about the minimum number of these individuals that are in an area, and also gives us a sort of a minimum estimate of the range size. And range size is one of the key criteria that we use to assess status. And so the absence of an observation of a species does not mean it's not there. It may mean nobody went there. And so certainly that is true. And this is the kind of thing that I'm really hoping that some clever people will push further to give us analytical tools to deal with that. Right now, those tools don't really readily exist, but this is something that we're mindful of. You know, the examples I've given you so far were, in many cases, they were somewhat anecdotal, not the ones about the decline of barn swallow, but a lot of them are just these fluke discoveries that people who are not experts have been making. And I think in some ways that's a strength of citizen science, is that it's open to anybody to find something, put a photo up, misidentify it if you do, and then watch and see what happens with experts coming in and giving advice on it. And so I think just even that level of participation by itself can be really valuable, and you've seen how COSEWIC mines that information.
I think that's a great kind of wrap up as well of what we've been talking about. Unless, John, there's any last question that you've seen come up that you'd like to address?
I'll just say, if citizen science isn't fun for you, then you're doing it wrong.
I agree.
Because I come back to what I said at the beginning. This is a hobby of mine. I'm a keen naturalist and I love photography. And so I put those two together, and some of these programs capture that for me. And so I think if you get into it as just as a hobby, as an extra thing to do when you're walking around with your phone, take a photograph of something, then to me, that's sort of that's the way most people interact with the sites, and that can certainly just be an awful lot of fun.
Yeah, I'm seeing lots of great feedback saying how much everybody appreciated this webinar and your insights, and excellent work and well done. So with that, definitely, I would echo that, and I thank you immensely for your time and insight and expertise on all of this, and look forward to speaking again.
Thanks very much, and thank you for everyone for the great discussion.
Yeah, thank you everyone for listening. And as I mentioned, this is recorded, so anybody can review this. Give us about a week or two to get it up on our website. And I want to thank everybody for taking the time, and those of you that stuck around for the extra Q&A time. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks.